U.S. President Donald Trump is firing back.
When it comes to a time when our country can't make aluminum and steel, you almost don't have much of a country.
With the G7 summit looming in a few weeks, sources say Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump are in direct discussions to reach a trade deal and lift tariffs.
When Donald Trump signed off on a shocking 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, it wasn't just another trade move. It was a thunderclap that sent shockwaves across North America. No one expected the fallout to hit this fast or cut this deep. Factories that once ran like clockwork suddenly found themselves scrambling. Detroit's auto giants, New York's construction crews, and even Seattle's aerospace industry all blindsided overnight. What seemed like a simple strategy to protect American jobs is now spiraling into a crisis touching nearly every corner of the U.S. economy. But here's the real twist. While some cheered the move as a patriotic stand, others warned it could backfire in ways no one saw coming. From soaring car prices to shaky supply chains, from political battles in Washington to ripple effects in global markets, this decision has opened a Pandora's box. And the biggest question remains, was this Trump's boldest economic gamble yet, or the spark that could set off a crisis stretching far beyond America's borders? The announcement came without warning. In a move that stunned allies and adversaries alike, Donald Trump signed an executive order slapping a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. Not 5%, not 10%, but a level so extreme that even seasoned trade experts called it unthinkable. For decades, the U.S. and Canada had been more than neighbors. They were economic partners, locked in one of the closest trade relationships in the world. Steel and aluminum flowed across the border almost seamlessly, fueling everything from Detroit's car factories to America's skyscrapers. That's why the decision felt less like a trade adjustment and more like a declaration of economic war. The shock was immediate. Within hours of the announcement, phones lit up in corporate boardrooms across North America. Executives scrambled to make sense of the new reality. Would they pass the costs to consumers, cut production, or search desperately for new suppliers in a market already stretched thin? And while Trump framed the move as a defense of American workers, critics saw something else, a risky gamble that could fracture supply chains, raise prices for millions of ordinary Americans, and strain one of America's most important alliances. But as industry leaders tried to calm investors, the storm clouds only grew darker, because the first sector to feel the full weight of Trump's tariff was none other than the beating heart of the American economy, Detroit's auto industry. Nowhere did the impact land harder or faster than in Detroit, the symbolic heart of America's auto industry. For decades, Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis had relied on a steady stream of Canadian steel and aluminum to build the cars and trucks that rolled off their assembly lines. But overnight, that steady flow turned into a raging storm. Prices for rolled steel and high-purity aluminum alloys, materials essential for car frames, engines, and body panels, soared by double digits. Every SUV, every pickup truck, every sedan suddenly cost more to produce. The choice for automakers was brutal. Absorb the skyrocketing costs and slash profits, or raise prices and risk losing millions of customers. Executives huddled in late-night meetings, crunching numbers, searching for a way out. But there was no easy fix. Domestic U.S. steelmakers couldn't meet the sudden surge in demand, and importing from distant markets like Asia meant higher shipping costs and months-long delays. And it wasn't just about economics, it was about survival. For an industry already under pressure from rising electric vehicle competition, global chip shortages, and shifting consumer habits, this tariff wasn't just a headache. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of Detroit. Every passing week, the ripple effects grew worse. Suppliers raised their prices, assembly lines slowed, and workers began whispering about possible layoffs. Even Wall Street took notice, as shares of major automakers began to tumble. But the auto industry wasn't the only one bracing for impact, because while cars were getting more expensive, another cornerstone of the U.S. economy was about to feel the squeeze, and this time, it was America's skyline itself that was at risk. If Detroit was the first city to feel the pain, the next shockwave hit the construction industry, and it hit like a wrecking ball. From the booming skylines of Dallas and Houston to massive infrastructure projects along the East Coast, steel is the invisible backbone holding everything together. Skyscrapers, stadiums, bridges, highways, none of them can rise without a steady, affordable supply of steel and aluminum. But after Trump's 50% tariff, that backbone suddenly became unbearably expensive. Contractors who had locked in budgets months in advance were now staring at bids that were worthless overnight. Steel beams, bridge girders, and rebar, all the essentials, spiked in price. Projects that were once profitable suddenly looked like money pits. Developers faced a terrible choice: pause construction, renegotiate deals, or eat the losses and pray investors stayed on board. And the timing couldn't have been worse. States like Texas, Florida, and New York were in the middle of record-breaking construction booms, skylines transforming by the month, highways being rebuilt, high-rises shooting into the sky. But now, cranes stood still, foundations sat empty, and entire projects risked collapse before they even began. Investors, always quick to sense danger, began to pull back. Banks grew nervous about financing massive builds that might never reach completion. Even local governments worried about ballooning costs for public infrastructure projects like bridges and rail lines. The dream of America's growing cities was now at risk of being buried under a mountain of unexpected expenses. But while construction faced a crushing financial blow, another industry, one where precision means everything, was about to face a crisis even more dangerous. Because in aerospace and defense, even the smallest delay can mean billions lost and security compromised. If construction projects could be delayed, the aerospace industry had no such luxury. Here, timing isn't just money, it's reputation, contracts, and national security. And the tariff hit this sector like a direct strike. In Seattle, home to Boeing and America's aviation giants, executives were blindsided. Aircraft fuselages, wings, and high-grade components depend almost entirely on Canadian aluminum alloys. Alloys prized for their strength, lightness, and durability. Switching to other suppliers wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. Why? Because every single material that goes into an aircraft must pass through years of rigorous certification and testing. One wrong step, one uncertified source, and the entire plane is grounded. Suddenly, Boeing faced a nightmare scenario. Costs surged, supply chains wobbled, and international customers began to question whether America's most famous plane maker could deliver on time. Delayed deliveries meant lost contracts, penalties, and, perhaps worst of all, damage to a reputation built over a century. But the stakes didn't stop with passenger planes. The U.S. defense industry was quietly panicking too. Advanced fighter jets, warships, armored vehicles, many relied on Canadian steel and aluminum alloys that couldn't simply be swapped out. These weren't just parts, they were strategic lifelines. Replacing them required not only money, but also time America didn't have. And here's the chilling part. Every month of delay didn't just cost dollars. It potentially created strategic gaps in U.S. military readiness. For an adversary watching from the outside, that kind of weakness was an opportunity. The aerospace and defense sectors had always been untouchable pillars of American strength. But now, for the first time in decades, they were vulnerable. And as shocking as this was, it was only the beginning. Because what started as an economic ripple was about to spread into industries no one expected. From oil pipelines to soda cans, and drag everyday Americans into the storm. By now, the auto industry was bleeding. Construction was paralyzed, and aerospace was scrambling. But the real shock was how far the ripple effects reached, into industries and households that, at first glance, seemed completely unrelated. Take energy, for example. From the oil fields of Texas to the icy pipelines of Alaska, the sector depends on steel that can withstand extreme pressure, brutal weather, and decades of wear. Canadian steel had long been the standard, trusted, certified, and battle-tested. But with tariffs driving costs through the roof, energy companies were forced into a corner: delay projects, pay double, or risk cutting corners. Each choice meant billions in lost revenue and missed opportunities in the global energy race. Then came agriculture, a sector that wasn't directly reliant on steel, but remembered the scars of 2018. Back then, when Trump first imposed tariffs, Canada struck back with punishing taxes on bourbon, motorcycles, and dairy. Farmers in Wisconsin, Kentucky, and Florida paid the price. And now, with tensions rising again, the fear was that Ottawa might retaliate once more, this time hitting beef, grains, or fruit exports. For farmers already struggling with rising costs and unpredictable weather, another trade war could be the breaking point. And it didn't stop there. Even everyday consumers felt the sting. Prices on cars, refrigerators, washing machines, and even soda cans began to creep higher. Aluminum wasn't just for airplanes, it was for the drinks in your fridge, the food on your shelf, and the appliances in your home. What started as a political play in Washington was now showing up on grocery receipts and car dealership price tags. For most Americans, the message was clear. This wasn't just about steel beams or tariffs on paper. It was about their jobs, their bills, and their future. But while ordinary people struggled, the political class in Washington saw something else entirely: an opportunity for power. And soon, the tariff wasn't just an economic story. It became a full-blown political earthquake. As the economic tremors spread, Washington turned into a battleground. The tariff wasn't just a policy, it was a political weapon, and every side was ready to use it. In the Rust Belt, lawmakers from states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan cheered. To them, this was a long-overdue victory for forgotten steelworkers. On campaign stages, the message was simple and powerful: Trump is protecting American jobs. For communities haunted by shuttered mills and decades of industrial decline, the tariff felt like a shot of adrenaline, a chance to bring back the glory days. But on the coasts, the reaction was the exact opposite. Politicians in California, New York, and Washington state warned that the tariffs would destroy more jobs than they saved. High-tech industries, aerospace, and medical equipment all depended on imported materials. To them, Trump's decision wasn't patriotism, it was economic sabotage. Behind closed doors, executives whispered about moving production overseas, a threat that could strip thousands of jobs from American soil. Even inside the White House, cracks began to show. Some advisors praised the move as a bold stand for America first. Others warned it was reckless, a gamble without a clear plan, leaving entire industries vulnerable to chaos. But for Trump, the tariffs weren't just policy, they were politics. They were a rallying cry, a headline, a chance to prove strength on the world stage. And once the order was signed, there was no turning back. Meanwhile, outside the Capitol, Wall Street had already made its judgment. The political fight was just heating up, but in the markets, the fallout was swift, brutal, and impossible to ignore. If Washington turned the tariff into a political football, Wall Street turned it into a bloodbath. The morning after Trump's announcement, steel and aluminum stocks spiked. For a moment, it looked like domestic producers might be the big winners. But the optimism didn't last. By the end of the week, the picture flipped. Shares of automakers, construction firms, aerospace companies, and appliance manufacturers began to nosedive. The industries that needed Canadian steel and aluminum most were now staring down shrinking profits and swelling costs. Investors hate uncertainty, and this tariff created a tidal wave of it. Commodity markets went wild. Steel and aluminum futures swung violently as speculators pounced on every price gap, turning the market into a casino. Trading volumes surged, but so did the risk. Nobody knew where prices would land tomorrow, let alone next month. The Canadian dollar came under immediate pressure. With its biggest export market, America, suddenly blocked by a wall of tariffs, Canada's economy looked shaky. But here's the twist. A weaker Canadian dollar made its exports more attractive to Europe and Asia. In other words, while U.S. companies were locked in chaos, Canada had an incentive to pivot away from its biggest partner and forge new trade alliances abroad. Meanwhile, analysts warned that the U.S. stock market was entering dangerous territory. Domestic steelmakers enjoyed short-term gains, but downstream industries, everything from auto suppliers to beverage companies, were bleeding. The more costs piled up, the more likely companies were to slash jobs, cut production, or even move operations overseas. For Wall Street, the tariff wasn't just a headline. It was a slow-motion earthquake, pulling at the foundation of the American economy. And as markets trembled, another storm brewed, not in boardrooms or trading floors, but on the global stage. Because the world was watching closely, and America's allies, rivals, and competitors were already preparing their next move. If the economic fallout was severe, the geopolitical aftershocks were even more dangerous. For decades, the United States and Canada had been inseparable, not just neighbors but allies, bound together by trade, defense, and trust. But with one signature, Trump had shaken the very foundation of that relationship. In Ottawa, the message was clear. If Washington could turn on Canada, no alliance was sacred. Canadian officials immediately began accelerating trade diversification, a strategy that had already gained traction after Trump's 2018 tariffs. New deals with Europe, Asia, and Pacific nations became more than opportunities. They became lifelines. Every contract signed abroad meant less reliance on America and less leverage for Washington in the future. South of the border, Mexico quietly seized the moment. Steel plants in Monterrey and Veracruz prepared to ramp up exports, filling gaps that Canadian suppliers once occupied. Suddenly, Mexico wasn't just America's junior partner under USMCA. It was gaining bargaining power, leverage that extended beyond trade into issues like energy and immigration. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic and Pacific, U.S. allies were taking notes. In Europe and Japan, leaders saw a chilling reminder. If even a NATO and G7 partner like Canada could be targeted, no one was untouchable. This pushed them to double down on their own supply chains, reducing reliance on U.S. materials and markets. But the most dangerous moves came from America's rivals. China, already the world's largest steel producer, saw an opening to flood global markets with cheaper exports, strengthening its grip on emerging economies through its Belt and Road projects. Russia, though not a major supplier to the U.S., also moved to court buyers searching for alternatives, using the chaos to deepen its influence abroad. And then there was defense. Canada wasn't just a trade partner. It was a strategic ally in NORAD, Arctic security and intelligence sharing. But as tensions escalated, cooperation risked becoming collateral damage. A rift in the U.S.-Canada relationship could weaken North America's security at the exact moment rivals were testing its resolve. What began as a 50% tariff on steel and aluminum had now morphed into something much larger, a potential reshaping of global power dynamics. America's allies were questioning its reliability. Its rivals were exploiting its divisions. And Canada, the country once seen as the U.S.'s most dependable partner, was quietly charting a path that might one day leave Washington behind. But the most haunting question remained. If one trade move could trigger this much chaos, what would the long-term consequences look like for America's economy, its alliances, and its global influence? What started as a single decision, a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, has spiraled into something far larger than anyone imagined. In the short term, Trump's move gave him a political win. He could stand before cheering crowds and promise that he was protecting American workers, bringing back jobs, and putting America first. For some in the Rust Belt, it felt like vindication, a leader finally fighting for them. But beneath the applause, the hidden costs were stacking up. Automakers in Detroit faced crippling expenses. Construction projects stalled in Texas and New York. Boeing and the defense industry scrambled to secure certified materials. Energy pipelines, farmers, and even everyday consumers felt the squeeze. And on Wall Street, the markets turned volatile, reflecting a nervous economy walking on a knife's edge. Then came the bigger shock, the geopolitical shift. Canada, long America's most trusted partner, began turning to Europe and Asia. Mexico quietly gained leverage. Allies like Japan and the EU grew more cautious. Rivals like China and Russia moved quickly to exploit the chaos. What looked like a simple trade barrier was, in reality, a signal to the world. America's alliances were no longer untouchable. The irony: while U.S. steelmakers might see a short-term boost, the downstream industries, the automakers, the builders, the innovators, are the ones paying the price. And once production leaves American soil, history shows it rarely comes back. So the question is this: was Trump's tariff truly a shield for American workers, or a double-edged sword, cutting deeper into America's own future? Because, in the end, this wasn't just about steel, aluminum, or even Canada. It was about trust, stability, and America's place in the global economy. And the lasting consequences of this gamble may not be felt today, but in the decades to come, when the world has moved on, and the U.S. finds itself fighting to reclaim the influence it once took for granted. The move was bold, the fallout is undeniable, and the shadow it casts may reshape North America and the world for years to come.